which is a different institution in Islam. But the importance of that institution in Islam is that it forbids human beings the right to forgive so that the souls are reborn and born again as the priest would do. In Islam, that authority is forbidden to any living human being. And so you are not permitted in Islam, for instance, to ask for forgiveness from a living human being, because that authority belongs only to God. And so the rebirth of souls that might have given him superiority in Christian doctrine, in Islamic doctrine, does not exist. But I have, for reasons of time, Chair, to thank and acknowledge all of those who have made it possible for us to gather here this evening and to ponder over such an important topic. So I thank you very much, Professor Chaka, and everyone else. For the sake of time, I thank everyone else who's made it possible for us to be here. It took quite an extended, effort to put the logistics together. So I decided for the task that was given to me this evening to gather together a few thoughts. And I'm hoping that in the 30 minutes that I have, I would be able to share with you these few thoughts. And I want to think of them as reflections, because in as much as I'm going to flag them, they would still require further elaboration and responses, from other people who are interested on the subject of studying race, or rather of studying, I'm a bit, admittedly obsessed with race, because I think it determines, everything. I'm uncertain that we can study even colonialism, slavery, and everything else without first understanding race, So that's why But so I have these few reflections that I want to share with you tonight, and as I've said, they might require further elaboration. And the first of these reflections would require me to tell you a elaborate historical narrative in simple terms. So in South Africa, beginning from the early 1800s, there is an effort to end slavery, which had been in existence in South Africa for years. And this attempt is very legal, it's strictly legal. And this attempt would manifest in several legislative pieces, but there were two of these that were very important. And it is these two legislative pieces that finally brought slavery to an end in South Africa. The first of these was what was called Ordinance number 50 of 1828. The second of these legislative pieces was called the Abolition Act of 1833, passed by the British Parliament. Now, what was the significance of these two legislative pieces? And I want to focus largely on the second one, which was the Abolition Act of 1833, because it actually led to an effective end, quote and unquote, of legislated slavery or legal slavery in South Africa, because it was very explicit in saying that on the 1st of December the following year, 1834, all slaves had to be freed. So slavery in South Africa legally ends as a result of the Abolition Act of 1833, as I've said, passed by the British Parliament. And this act was to be applicable to all British colonies. So it was not specific just to South Africa, but Britain passing this act said that slavery in all its colonies was to end. And so it was the same thing in the Caribbean and all other, British colonies. As a result of this act, slavery came to an end. And as I've said, as a result of this act, well, I hadn't said this, but as a result of this act in South Africa, an upward of 38,000 slaves were to be free as from the 1st of December 1834. This is a very conservative number of slaves, at the time in South Africa. But if you were to look at the records, as I've tried to do, the number would most likely be 10 times that. But it says, the record says that an upward of 38,000 slaves were freed as a result of this act as from the 1st of December 1834. And as I've said, this act by the British Parliament provided for the end of slavery in all former British colonies. But it also said something more than just the freeing of slaves on the 1st of December 1834. This very act by the British Parliament provided a sum of 20 million pounds to be paid to the slave owners in 19 British colonies that were to be affected by this law. So there is 20 million pounds in 1838. You can, of course, if you're an economist, look at the real value of that today. If we are talking 28 million in 1838, for 19 British colonies that were to be affected. So South Africa was part of the 19 British colonies that were to be, or were to benefit from the payment of former slave owners as a result, as the legislation said, as a result of their loss to property occasioned by the law. So South Africa was to benefit from that sum, or rather South Africa was allocated from that sum of 20 million pounds, eventually ended with 1.2 million pounds, amounting in real terms to 34 pounds per slave. So if you lost a slave as a slave owner in South Africa, eventually that came down to 34 pounds per slave. Of course, I do have to tell you that the initial calculation that had been done as to the amount that needed to be paid, the initial amount had been pegged at 73 pounds per slave. So the 34 pounds that would eventually be paid was far less than what had initially been calculated to be the exact amount of loss that, the slave owners would have incurred. What, of course, I do not have to tell you was that it is not the enslaved that were to be compensated here, but those that enslaved others. To be explicit, who was to be compensated here was not those who had suffered the wrath of slavery, but it was those who had enslaved other people. Those were the people who were to be compensated. That's fairly obvious enough. And so the British Parliament had said and decided that the people who were really at a loss as a result of slavery were not the enslavers, but were rather not the enslaved, but the enslavers. And that was the law. And perhaps this is where I agree partly or implicitly with, Umkabateli about the law. Because this was the law. It said the person at a loss is not the one who's been robbed of his or her humanity. The person at a loss is the one who has robbed the other of his or her humanity. And so this is the one that we must compensate, not the one who's been robbed of his or her humanity. And this was to be the law. But it was not just to be the law. Indeed, as we are going to see in a moment, compensation was paid to the slaveholders in South Africa. So let us continue in following the life of this law. As I've said, the initial calculation was 73 pounds per slave, but eventually what South Africa got, alongside the other 18 British colonies was 34 pounds per slave. Now, this compensation, this is where my point is, my first point of reflection is, it's not about this narrative that you can find in the records. There's nothing I've added to this, it's in the records. my interest is in the wider significance or impact of this act of compensation, because I want to suggest to you that the compensation had a wider significance and impact rather than just paying reparations to slave owners. In fact, the act called it reparations. So the name reparations is not my imposition, it was the act itself that called that reparations. So the compensation had a wider significance and impact rather than just paying reparations to the slave owners. But before I tell you of this wider significance, I do want to enlighten you a bit about how pervasive slavery was in South Africa at the time. Because the 38,000 number is basically an underestimation. I do want to tell you how pervasive slavery was in South Africa at the time, particularly in the Cape Colony where it was most prevalent. And the Cape Colony, of course, was a British, colony. So maybe what we inherited from the British was not just its Westminster culture of constitutionalism, but also it was, the practice, the theory and practice of slavery. How, the practice of slavery actually, or to put this more explicitly, to enslave someone required a crafting of everyday relations between the slave master and the slave, other than what was provided for in law. The law on its own was not enough, and so every day in slave plantations and in in places where slaves existed, every day the master basically had to recreate the rules or the informal rules of the relations, between the slave and the master. And these rules were often not written. So my point is about the prevalence of slavery in the British colony is to suggest that there is perhaps a culture of slavery or enslaving that remains to be studied in the study of British colonialism rather than the study of colonialism in the Americas, particularly in America, as we seem to do in thinking that America, the United States of America, is the epitome of, how the blacks were enslaved. But we'll get to that point. So the point I want to enlighten you about is how prevalent slavery was, in South Africa at the time in 1834, particularly in the Cape Colony, which was a British colony. So we do know from the same historical records that in the 1800s, 8 of 10 slaves in South Africa were in the Cape. So there is a strong political culture and history of slavery in the Cape. Now, for people who study empirical political science or empiricist social science, the focus is often on, there was this number of slaves. We aren't able to track the intangible ethic that remains in that society after slavery has ended. Because the existence of 8 out of 10 slaves in the Cape would mean that there is a certain political culture that would remain in the Cape even after slavery had ended as a result of this prevalence of slavery in the Cape. So as I've said, 8 out of 10 slaves were in the Cape. Wine farmers in the Cape had the largest share of the average ownership. Averagely, wine farmers owned 16 slaves each, whereas other slave owners averagely throughout the colony would have something like 5.6, per slave owner. So it must mean that there is a culture that is closely associated with wine farming that is steeped in the culture of slavery, because it was the wine farms that had, if you compare the averages, 16 compared to 5.6 in all the other sectors of the colonial economy. So, with those two, let us return then to the wider significance or impact of the reparations paid to the slave owners. So all of the claims, by the claims we mean simply that you had a slave owner who had 100 slaves and therefore could submit a claim that I had 100 slaves and then I needed to be compensated. But it was not 34 by 100 slaves, it was 34 by 100 plus the mortgage on the slaves. Plus the mortgage on the slaves. So basically, with a small number of slaves, you basically would become rich. Once you were able, of course, to make a claim as a slave owner, and you could submit, those claims. So from here henceforth, by claims, I mean simply that 34 pounds, times the number of slaves plus mortgage, on the slaves. And you had farmers who had mortgage up to 400,000 pounds in 1834. So when you talk about, so that when the point is not lost, when you talk about historical wealth of white people, or what do you call it, what's the more fashionable word people use? That's where it comes from. So, as I've said, averagely, wine farmers had more slaves than, all the others, and the ratio was 16, and on the other hand, it was 5.6. And so, with that in mind, let us return, as I've said, to the larger impact and significance of, these reparations paid to slave owners. Now, all of the claims that were to be made by the farmers, or the slave owners, because there were slave owners who were not farmers, all of these claims were to be settled in London. None were to be settled here. The claims were to be made in London. This, of course, opened the way for agents who brokered all sorts of deals and arrangements with the slave owners, which is to say that the fact that the claims were to be settled in London, but the slave owners were in South Africa, this opened the way for brokers to enter into all kinds of agreements and deals with the slave owners. And here were the deals, basically. Because the farmer is in South Africa, and it's going to take an effort to lodge a claim in London, the broker, who's often a British citizen who's able to travel between South Africa and London with ease, will go to the farmer and say, what do you estimate your claim to be? And, the broker will calculate and say, well, your claim is this much. I can pay you and you give me the power of attorney over the claim. I'm going to go and lodge it in Britain. And so many of the farmers or many of the slave owners actually sold their claims to these brokers at 10 to 20% less than the real value. There emerged a different class of people who made money out of nothing. Basically out of the ability to say to the slave owner, I will pay you whilst I go lodge your claim. And so there was basically, other than those who benefited from actually owning slaves, there was a different category that emerged of the brokers. And these are companies, by the way, that have names that still exist today that you would hear of just now. So, the fact that all the claims were to be settled in London, as I've said, opened the way for agents who brokered all sorts of deals with the slave owners or bought their claims at hugely discounted prices. As a result of this whole endeavor, so much money flowed into South Africa as had never been seen before. As a result of slavery, so much money flowed into South Africa as had never been seen before when these settlements were eventually paid. Here is the impact, and here is, I think, what I want to contribute to, to the argument about the need for the study of slavery, colonialism in South Africa. It is that the impact of that capital injection on the economy would only be comparable to the discovery of gold and diamonds. There was never such a capital injection with so much fundamental impact on the economy of this country other than slavery and the discovery of gold and diamond combined. Now, it's not in equal measure as to how much the other brought, but it's in the nature of the impact that, this brought. Of course, gold and diamond brought more money compared in real terms with slavery, but in terms of triggering, what economists call, the trickle down, or what they call, the reverse effects, it was the same impact. So the amount of money that flowed into South Africa, the capital injection that flowed into the South African economy as a result of these reparations was only comparable in impact to the discovery of gold and diamonds combined. Now let me try and illustrate what I mean. So because of this capital injection, there was a need for banking houses to hold this money. In South Africa comes out precisely out of the need to hold this excess liquidity in the economy. So that's what I mean when I say the impact was because as a result of this flow of capital into South Africa, there was a need, a felt need for commercial banks that would be able to manage these transactions. It was not just managing the money that had come in, but also you needed to be able to manage the movement of money between here and London, and so you needed commercial banks that would be able to do that. So my way of illustrating this impact is to say that because of this capital injection, the first private commercial bank in the colony was established in 1837. Barely a few years after 1834. 1837, the first commercial bank. The second attempt at demonstrating this impact takes me to another example. Now, for some reason, the literature chooses to refer to a white settler called J.B. Ebden. It refers to him as a Cape Town merchant. Basically, this was a white settler, in Cape Town, who decided to admit as a legal tender the claims to the compensation money. So he basically said, if you have a claim to compensation money, that claim is going to be admissible as legal tender, which is to say it would be admissible as money. Basically, you can transact with it. But, he said, you can only transact in one respect, which is, Ebden had a son who lived in Australia, and they had started a business of importing merino ships into South Africa. And so J.B. Ebden said, well, you can use your claim to buy these merino ships that I sell. And so there is, in 1835, an auction in Cape Town of these Australian merino ships. The Australian merino ships that Ebden is conducting, and he admits, these claims as legal tender. The result of this was the transformation of the agricultural sector in the Cape and in the country at large. Because many of the slave owners ended up being the leading sheep farmers or also dealers in wool, because wool was yet another commodity in the Cape that was very important. So when you today look at the pattern, the agricultural development of this country, and white people tell us that we brought an agriculture that is advanced, basically on slavery, on the money earned from slavery. So there is nothing really of superior quality about Afrikaners or white people telling us that they created an agricultural sector. It is built on money earned from slavery. So those were the two examples through which I tried to demonstrate that the significance of the reparations paid to slave owners went far beyond just the payment of money. They would shape the country in significant ways up until the present. And hardly have we been able to understand some of these present exigencies in South Africa whose history is traceable to slavery, because we haven't had an institute dedicated to the study of slavery in South Africa. Is lost to us. Slave compensation money or reparations paid to slave owners provided the capital base that would lead to the development of two sectors of the South African economy: the livestock agricultural sector and the commercial banking sector. It was slavery that enabled or that provided the seed money, so to say, to use today's language, that provided the seed money for the development of those two sectors of the South African economy. So why is all of this necessary to recount? I think it is necessary to recount all of this because several academic and political questions arising out of the existence of slavery in South Africa remain unanswered today. And part of the reason why I want to focus more on the academic reason why our study and understanding of slavery has been impoverished is because that we have taken, which is not to minimize, the significance of that experience, but we've taken the experience of transatlantic slavery, particularly of slavery to the America by, of black Americans, to be the epitome of slavery. In fact, today, even the understanding of blackness seems to be limited just to, what experience or what was experienced by slaves taken to the Americas. In fact, if, the point has not been driven home enough, today people take the ship and the Atlantic Ocean basically as the metaphor for understanding slavery. There was slavery here that didn't need the ship, that didn't need, the Atlantic. Many of the slaves in the Cape came from the rest of the continent. Perhaps, to be specific, many of the slaves came from West Africa. The second category of the slaves came from Madagascar. So you would say maybe there was an element of the ship. And many of the slaves came from Angola and Mozambique, particularly Angola, and fewer from Mozambique. And of course, many would also come from the other Dutch territories, in the far-off lands. Now, because we have assumed, and to add to that point, so the first ship to land in the America with slaves landed in 1619, if my recollection is correct. Slavery in South Africa was already in existence at that time, because the Portuguese had long been in South Africa prior to the coming of the Dutch in 1652. So the experience of slavery does not begin with the transatlantic slavery or with the transatlantic slave trade. Just as it is that the plantation, in the Americas is not the only site for the constitution of blackness. Now here I want to be specific because this university has also contributed a bit to that poverty of thought. It is this importation wholesale of scholarship from America into studying blackness. It is the supposition that once you have read and understood the literature from America, you've understood blackness in its totality. In fact, not only that you have understood it, that blackness that emerges out of that experience becomes the norm with which to explain every other experience of blackness. And to those who are convinced of this experience, I want to suggest an intellectual challenge. For those who were taken across the Atlantic, their identities were suspended, first on the water and then on a foreign land. What would it mean to think about people who are enslaved but their feet remain on the soil? Surely, if you went into the metaphysical experience of that slavery, it has to be different. Others retained an attachment to the ancestral world, others lost it completely. And so we can't use that example as a way of understanding the experience of slavery, because others remained rooted, with their feet on the land. Others had their identities suspended. So I suspect then, if we first accept that there is a significant experience of slavery in South Africa that is understandable with its own specificity, would then depend less. Not that we shouldn't study. There are comparable experiences, no doubt. But I suspect that most of those who study blackness and slavery in passing or, alongside that, using the American experience, think that it is the all of blackness. So they've somewhat closed the intellectual field within which to try and understand slavery. So that's my first reflection that I thought I will bring, to you this evening. The second reflection which I wish to volunteer is that slavery, or rather that in the larger historiography of slavery, South African role has not been appropriately analyzed. The South African role in slavery has not been appropriately analyzed in the larger historiography of slavery. Because, as we've partly shown, the supposition is that Africa was an exporter of slaves, particularly sub-Saharan Africa. The supposition is that sub-Saharan Africa was just an exporter of slaves. And so we think of slavery as an experience we had of people from these parts being taken away. And of course, it doesn't help that we think of Sarah Baartman as having been the only female slave that ever left South Africa. The point I'm making is that you actually had within the continent a country that enslaved other parts of the continent. And so if you understand slavery in its proper sense in South Africa, it is that in the circuit of the flow of slavery, there was an inflow of slaves into South Africa. And so if we then study slavery properly, we'll then see that the larger historiography of slavery will have to change from our understanding, of slavery, where we think of it as having been a transatlantic, or the Middle Passage. I may, as I am talking here, actually, I'm reminded of yet another aspect of slavery that we don't think about because of this, obsession with the American, academy. It is that if you go to a part, two, in fact, thoughts come to mind. If you go to a part of India called Pondicherry, you find a people called the Sidi people. The Sidi people are African people, are people of African origin who were enslaved, mostly into the Raj, into different houses, in India. And this is way before, transatlantic, slavery. Until today, the Sidi people in India are considered to be African and they are discriminated against. In fact, they are worse than, people of the lower caste in India. Now, all of this because of the gaze, that we have towards the North American Academy, then gets elided in our understanding of slavery in South Africa. But the other point that came to mind as I was talking about this is the fact that those of us who studied history, you know, before you did, read about what was called the caravans of Kola. If you know the Kola nuts in Chinua Achebe's Things Fall Apart. So the caravans of Kola is basically a metaphor taken from that, because the first forms, not the first forms, the earlier forms of slavery were actually across the Sahara. Slaves taken across the Sahara to the Arabic world. So it's called the caravans of Kola because the first thing that excited the Arabic people was kola nut, you know, because it is a stimulant. So they came looking for the stimulant. In other places, you know, they chew different kind of, you know, stick, you know, but basically it's a stimulant. And they came in search of kola, and in the search of kola, discovered the slaves, the infidels. And so, much earlier than transatlantic slave trade, there were caravans of kola to the Arabic world. And often when I try to demonstrate this point to my students, you know, who look at me disbelieving but unable to say I'm not correct, I say to them, you must look at the Saudi Arabian football team. Half the team is black. These are not recent immigrants into Saudi Arabia. These are generations from that carryover of early slavery. You know, so that's proof, you know, that that kind of slavery existed. But all of this I'm saying in order to drive a point home, which is that because of our fixation with the American experience of slavery, or with the transatlantic, you know, slavery, we have missed important aspects in the historiography of slavery, particularly aspects that pertain to South African slavery. And, of course, to go over that point, it is that unlike other sub-Saharan countries which exported slaves, South Africa was actually an importer of slaves from many parts of the world, but also from the rest of the continent: West Africa, Madagascar, Angola, and Mozambique. But also, an elaborate system of slavery existed in South Africa, complete with its own laws, prescripts, and ethics, because the relations of the slave to the master, or the relations of the master to the slaves, are not only governed by legal prescripts. There is something more that you need in the everyday, because when the mistress meets, you know, a slave, the mistress isn't going to go back into, the law says you must not look me in the eye. This is everyday behavior that is established in the relations between the slave and the master. And so it means that wherever slavery existed, a certain social ethic develops. And that ethic does not end with the end of slavery. That ethic continues to subsist way after slavery itself has ended. I think that hardly have we even begun to think or ask the question, what could be the enduring effects of slavery properly understood in South Africa that far outlive the time and space of its occurrence? So the domination, as I've said, of the study of slavery by the American experience, I suspect has done us a disservice. It is partly that disservice that were you to establish, you know, this institute, you would be able to address. Because I think that while South African slavery certainly shared and continues to share certain features with transatlantic slavery or transatlantic societies of slavery, slavery marked South Africa in a very specific way. There are certain specificities in the way in which slavery marked South Africa that cannot be read of the experience of other societies, particularly transatlantic, those that experience transatlantic slavery. Let me try and demonstrate what I think are these specificities or particularities of slavery in South Africa, or the way in which slavery marked the South African society distinctly from the other experiences of slavery. We know that the plantation, basically in America, was the laboratory where the meaning of slavery was threshed out and finally, come to a complete, coherent set of ideas. Now, there were a few things that happened in the plantation that we know. It is that a distinction of gender did not exist in the plantation. Whether you were a male slave or a female slave, it didn't matter. You did exactly the same tasks. The other thing we know about the plantation as basically a laboratory or a field site is that the plantation or transatlantic slave experience abolished not only gender identities, it also abolished ethnic identities. One of the things that transatlantic slavery cautiously did was to ensure that people of African origin lost their ethnic identities. The language was not permitted. Their cultural practices were not permitted. The act of not selling members of the same family to the same, plantation was deliberately to separate them so that there is no lineage or there is no attempt to trace a lineage amongst them. And so over time, or more specifically, at the end of slavery in the transatlantic world, there was not a single group or category of slaves that could recreate their ethnic identity. The best they could do was to claim to be of African origin. Because they had lost the language, they had lost the culture, and lost everything that was not permitted in the plantation. Now, I want to suggest to you that South African slavery was different in that regard, because whereas transatlantic slavery basically sought to erase ethnic identities and cultural particularities, South African slavery actually emphasized and engendered those ethnic distinctions. How? And for that, I'm going to read to you, evidence from the historical record on how the slavery in the Cape actually engendered ethnic, and cultural identities in contradistinction to transatlantic, slavery. And here I quote from a historical text by a historian called Timothy Keegan. Here is what Timothy Keegan says, and I quote, "Stereotyping by origin was also evident in manumissions." Hear that? Stereotyping by origin was also evident in manumissions. Of foreign-born slaves manumitted, those of Asian origin greatly outnumbered those of African or Madagascan origin. Although their respective proportions of the populations were not dissimilar. It was regarded as natural for slaves of Madagascan or African origin to work in the field, while the skilled artisan and service worker slaves in Cape Town, who were more likely to win their freedom, were largely of Asian origin. Local-born slaves, and particularly part European slaves, came to be specifically favored for manumission. So you can see that there is basically a system of identities that exists in the Cape, but this system of identities is not just idle. It was in the interest of slaves to maintain these identities because there were some who were preferred or treated preferentially because of their identities. So if you were a locally born slave, particularly part European, you knew that it was in your interest to maintain your identity because you were favorably treated when it came to manumission. Now, this was one way in which ethnic identities and other identities in South Africa come to be engendered. A system that ensures that there is a reward in actually maintaining identities, even when these identities are as dubious as anything, because you can see how dubious these identities are. Slaves who were from African or Madagascan origin, I mean. But of course, people held on to these distinctions. They would identify themselves as Madagascan and others would identify as Africans because they were specific, or there was treatment fit for people, of these different identities. And so there was a benefit in maintaining these identities. The point in all of this is that whereas slavery in the transatlantic world erased particularities, including gender particularities, slavery in South Africa actually engendered those particularities. And this is how identities in South Africa would continue, to be salient until today. The third reflection, and I will go to the last and shut up. The third is that, again, it requires me to tell you a bit of, a narrativized academic information. So I'm sure many of you here would have read or heard of a novel by Toni Morrison titled Beloved. Now, the novel by Toni Morrison, Beloved, is basically a novel about the main character, I think, is Sete, who decides, he's a slave, who decides to kill the daughter because she didn't want, her children to become slaves. Of course, it is because in the American experience, children born of slaves at the age of 12 became the property of the slave owner. So, Sete decides to kill her daughter because she didn't want to, she didn't want her daughter, or all her children, I think she had 3, but she was restrained before she could get to the other, children. So that's Beloved. But Beloved is actually a recreation of an experience by a slave called Margaret Garner. Margaret Garner had decided, together with her husband and her mother, the grandmother to the children, they had decided to escape slavery. Of course, the slave catchers, as they were called, came after them, and as they were closing in on them in the house where they were hiding, Margaret Garner, in the presence of her mother, decided to seize off the first child, killed her, and took hold of the second child, and was in the process of killing the second child when the slave catchers happened on the house. Now, court records tell us that the grandmother to the children, or the mother to Margaret Garner, had to testify in court, and when she was asked, why did she sit there? Was it because she was encouraging to the act, and so because the court wanted to find her complicit in the act? She said, no, I sat there, neither encouraging nor discouraging of the act. And so for her, it really didn't matter. It was the same thing. She was saying slavery and death were the same thing. Now, why do I tell this story? It is because one of the things that I think we should learn, or could learn, from transatlantic slavery, particularly in the Americas, is that those who have written of slavery in America using the memories of slavery have enabled the writing of the historiography of slavery and, in part, colonialism, not only as political. So if you ended with the court records, for instance, of Margaret Garner's case, you would not be able to write a different historiography of slavery that is not political, but that is cultural, but that is also sentimental. Now this is why, or this is what I think we could learn from the experience of, those who have written about slavery in the transatlantic world. It is that they have used slavery, or they have used the hard evidence of slavery in order to create a different historiography of slavery. So they've used the memories of slavery in order to write a historiography of slavery that is a cultural historiography of slavery, not only just a political historiography. If that sounds confusing, the point is simple. If you are interested in just saying the facts are that Margaret Garner killed the child on this date and this date, you won't have this other alternative side of discourse that people like Toni Morrison and several other writers have created in thinking about slavery. If you were, in the artistic world, you would think about the possibility of creating from this political historiography another narrative of slavery that is not a political narrative, but that is, a cultural narrative or an artistic narrative of slavery. The Color Purple, and several others that we can think of. Now, if you think about South Africa, no such historiography of colonialism exists. Now, that historiography of colonialism you can't have until you have recreated slavery that existed in South Africa, so that you are able then to build on that to create that cultural narrative or historiography of slavery. So when you do establish the institute, do not be too obsessed with the reeling of the political history of slavery. I suspect that you might gain more if you actually found people in the less empiricist sciences to lead it. There might be more that will come out of it than those who would be obsessed with collecting all the archival documents and dumping them there without a work of creation coming out of it. And I think that is what we can learn from the transatlantic experience of slavery, that it was not just a reeling of the injustices, but it is that those injustices were used to trigger a creative, production. So that's my third reflection, and the last one is, I could pose it in a form of a rhetorical question. Why is it that we still think of apartheid as something different or distinct from colonialism? Why do we think that apartheid is not colonialism? Why is it that in South Africa, in academic terms, people find it necessary to distinguish apartheid from colonialism? Because the history of colonialism in South Africa is yet to be written from the perspective of the black colonized, it is for that reason that we still rely on categories and concepts that were given to us by the same white settler colonizers. Now, partly, Ndumiso referred to, how the creation of apartheid was just an attempt to dump the responsibility for it on the Afrikaners. I think it was more than that. All white scholars in South Africa are agreed that, let me try and do this differently. If you were to ask yourself again, when did South Africa become independent? Anyone wants to volunteer? When did South Africa become independent? So other people will say 1910. Other people will say 1961. Other people, I think even fewer, will say 1994. You know what's the reason for that confusion? It is because if you control the categories with which you think about history, you are then able to leave a people even uncertain when they became independent. 27th of April is not Freedom Day, it's Independence Day. But because the categories that we think about or that we use to think about our history are given to us, we are then left with a misrepresentation of our own very experience. So I suspect that the distinction between apartheid and colonialism is self-serving, because the end of apartheid can be. So if South Africa up until 1993 was a colonial society, logically what should have followed is independence. It couldn't be freedom. But because you call it apartheid, then it becomes possible to then engage in gymnastics, in conceptual gymnastics, basically so that you obfuscate the actual reality of 1994. So my point is that I suspect that the distinction between apartheid and colonialism itself must be up for intellectual interrogation. I have no authority to pass a judgment that it is unnecessary to abolish the distinction. But I suspect that there is gain intellectually in thinking about them as one, because South Africa then becomes comparable to other cases of settler colonialism. And so we are able to think about the experience of South Africa in exactly the same way as we think about other settler colonies. But now, if you think about this one as being apartheid and this one as being colonialism, the basis for comparison itself, you must start by establishing the basis for comparison, whereas I think that the basis for those comparisons are a given. I thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Lwazi Lushaba. Always now we are going into a brief discussion. I will take 2 questions per speaker, meaning from all of you, 2 questions directed at one speaker and the other and the other. Then we'll let them respond to that. After that, we'll give 5 minutes to Professor Siepe to say 5 minutes only to give your own observations, and then 5 minutes to Professor Ramose to give his own observations. So, and then we'll close, and then we'll have Professor Chaka do the vote of thanks, and then we can go. As a Gadamerian and delighting in conversation, in dialogue, I know one thing about dialogue: it is endless. So unless we do it like this, and then we go home, continue the dialogue with us, our spouses, and so on, we will not get home. So 2 questions, not 2 questions from one person. You ask only 1 question, and then it will be 2 per speaker. So let's go. Let's begin with questions for Kim. Do you have a question for Kim? No, I want 2 questions for Kim, and then we'll go to 2 questions for. Do you have 2 questions for Kim? A question? Where? Is that a question for Kim? Yeah, okay. No, you ask. There will be someone. After you've spoken, there will be obviously someone. Yeah. Yeah, Teta Ma'am.
Evening, Kim. My name is Zama. So the first thing I want to basically touch on is the point that you made about black children normalizing landlessness, poverty, and hunger. And I don't want to ask a question, but I want to clarify you on that point first, before I pose my question. And my clarification is based on my lived experience as a person, as a black person in this country, as an indigenous umuntu in this country, and the philosophical belief systems that I subscribe to, which are not in agreement with your point. And I will basically just touch on the hunger point, to say that we have various philosophical tenets, in my language specifically, which is isiZulu, which speak on the abnormality of the situation of hunger. And I will give you two. The first one says, indlala ibanga ulaka, which means hunger causes violence. And I think from your own deductions, you can get a whole lot of things in your mind running about the kind of violence that hunger and poverty and neediness causes in a situation. And I think that violence is evident in our country. The second one says, ikatililele eziko. In the olden days, they used to cook on the floors, and they would dig a hole in the ground in the hut where they make the fire. And when there's no food, there is no need to make a fire. And so when there's no fire, the cat of the household, which is the pet, would then go and lie there to show that something is wrong. There's no fire there. So it can go and lay there. Lilele eziko. So those are just two. But there are so many others that speak on the situation of hunger in indigenous communities and its abnormality. So there's never a point in a black child's life or a black person's life where hunger will ever be normalized. It's accepted. But it is only accepted because of the situation or the kind of society we find ourselves in. And that is a society that has human rights within its constitution, but does not have the right to food. Because it does not care about the situation of being hungry. Because this constitution is constituted from laws which are influenced by Euro-Western philosophical views. I will leave it at that.
Yeah.
And then my question wanted to go to the point of forgiveness. Because every now and then in spaces, just less than a month ago, we also came across, during a seminar, a white woman like yourself who said, what can we do as white people to get, how can we ask for forgiveness? And I want to know from you what you think could constitute the right apology. Because also the way we view apologies and your view of apology is different. And if you'd like me to clarify you on that, I can do it after this. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Another question. You see what I said about dialogue being endless? In Xhosa we say, inqoko izala maduna namatokazi. So it just keeps on going. So, second question for Kim.
All right. Thank you. I just wanted to ask, there was a lot of emphasis in your talk on... Oh, do I have to get...
And your name?
Okay, my name is Marcia Milazzo.
Marcia Miaso.
Marcia Milazzo. All right.
Okay.
Now I forgot what I wanted to ask. No. There was a lot of emphasis in your talk on, you spoke about the black mind more than once, and it was at the center of the paper. But I was wondering if, as a white person and writer, it wouldn't be important to kind of reveal some of the mechanisms of the white mind that, of course, we have more knowledge about, and also, you know, some of these mechanisms of white disavowal, for example, that also appeared in your talk, right? The disassociation from the real racist who would cry, right? Isn't that also like a technology to kind of position yourself as the good white at the same time as you're talking about the totality of white power? So why not then really speak about the totality of white power, right? why not actually reveal, instead of speculating about black people's minds and, in a certain sense, maybe almost blaming the victim, right? Why not actually be more self-reflective and critical of white people and what, you know, Du Bois called the souls of white folks, like the mind you really know something about, right? Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Now, shall Kim answer and then we move on, or shall we take all of them? Okay. I had asked Professor Chaka about Magbe Kuchwala app, and he has.
It's just a metaphor. I don't drink.
Yes. You know, it's a metaphor from me too. I also don't drink.
Thank you. My name is Itumeleng.
Yes. Is that for
Ndumiso.
Dr. Zaza?
Yes, from Ndumiso.
He says, please add some bra in front. Brandooms.
Brandooms. And Ndumiso, one of the things that I've been struggling with in my own research, working in 19th century literature, is this idea of replacing indigenous symbolism, language symbolism, with European languages. And to what extent can you maybe elaborate for us about it in how it intersects with the idea of conquest? Thanks.
Yeah. Thank you. Another one for Dr. Laza. What happened to you, Lerato? You're not asking any questions.
Thank you. I guess for me it's not a question. I guess for me it's not a question per se, but a comment like on this idea of war. Because it was interesting for me when I was doing my PhD on Desmond Tutu in Europe, and they were very fascinated by the idea of Ubuntu, you know, and forgiveness as the idea of post-1994 Ubuntu kind of vibes that, you know, these are Christians, like Christian theologians. We don't have this idea of if you do something to me, you know, vengeance is what I have to find just, like war is what must happen. So, and then there was this overemphasis that in a way, South Africa is special in a way because for us, we have this idea of after war, of not wanting to fight or rebel. So then I always disputed this. I was like, there's no such thing. If you do something to me, also I want to rebel and do something back to you. So, but the thing is that I'm just thinking of how also Christianity, now because I'm a theologian, has sort of like also, though you are tracing it from law and stuff, but within also Christian theology, especially because they use Aristotle. I don't know if you have any comment on that, how it links. But I didn't have time. I mean, those are the things were difficult in my PhD, because then I just touched on Plato and Aristotle, and that this idea of forgiveness doesn't exist in Western philosophy. We don't talk about forgiveness because the theorizer is God. Therefore, God cannot ask for forgiveness. So the only logical thing is that is somehow, I don't know how to connect it somehow, but they link it with war, that you need to do something. Like Biden says, when Afghanistan, 13 soldiers were killed, he's like, we shall never forgive, you know, we shall not. But when it's South Africa, we say forgiveness, Ubuntu, and all these things. But I just want to ask about the linkage between Christianity and war itself. How you think it links?
Okay, thank you. 2 questions for Commandante.
Thank you. Commandante, your presentation is very much
thought-provoking, and I want to ask you a question in terms of our identification as black people, that it's not informed by us, it's not coming from us, starting from the days of slavery. You know, when we came in here, I saw my brother from EFF firstly as a black person. But when we started to talk politics in this table, we were drifting apart bit by bit, because we were identifying ourselves based on political parties. We started, the blackness vanished away because of political party system. That black unity moved away from us. We were arguing. We had nothing to agree on, because based on political party system, we started to label ourselves as political parties, not as black people who are facing the same cruelty, the same economic system that makes us to suffer. Our pigmentation, we are all exploited, not based on political parties, but because we are black. Will you agree with me, commentator, to say that the current political party system is un-African, including democracy? It has nothing to do with us as black people. That is why each and every political party that comes, that is going to divide more people more, to have divisions, whether it's going to tear ANC apart, the multi-party political system that we are having, is being funded by foreigners, those who have money, that let them continue to be divided so that they cannot have that particular black power. And we think that that is a way to go. Will you agree with me if I say the political party system is foreign also, including democracy, and they are doing it deliberately, as you took it from the time of slavery, 1834, where people were paid and identification served as a thing to tear us apart?
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. And then let's have the last question for Professor Lwazi Lushaba.
Just one question before I give to him.
What was that? What?
No, I'm saying, Chair, I also have one question before I give to him.
No, you ask your question.
No, thank you. My question, any of the panelists can take it.
No, I want for now, okay, if you want a general question, let's have one question for Commander, and then I'll let you ask that question
I'll
after.
give it to Commander.
Okay, sure.
Bringing that was speaking about the economic system. My question is going to be based on the analysis of the Karl Marx and Engels, but taking it back 200 years ago, coming from the Wesley brothers, who came up with the Wesley Manifesto. And the question that I want to ask is that, what are the practical ways from an economic system using the Merino approach that you talked about that can be done by black people to ensure that they are not dependent on the social grant system? That is my question. But the footnote to that question is based on the experience, because I don't like to do abstracts. I prefer smart objectives that can be tangible. It's going to be based on a dropout of grade level person that I saw every day when I was coming to the Sobukwe lecture. Sobukwe was coming here. Now what happens is that this guy dropped in grade 11. He's selling nyama and rog. He's got a big stove and a gas stove. And he comes out with a big pot with the papa. Now he says that he doesn't see a need for him to go back to school and finish his degree because he won't get a job. But with what he's doing here, he's able to make more than what graduates make. So my question is, what are the economic systems that we can look at as black people to remove?
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much. I now will hand over to the speakers. What's that? Okay.
Afuna sibuze baba.
I don't know. That's the last one.
Umasisange kamgetsu lo ndicinga ba okay mandizise ku Brandums. Sabuza wena eMzantsi Afrika kwimeko yabantu base-Israel. Ndibuzisa lo mbuzo yile nto yoba ndicinga mna kweyam ingqondo ukuba kungayekwa ukuliwa namhlanje kwela lizwe, aba bantu bacinezekileyo bangakwazi uphinda babuyele kwisiqu sabo okanye kwiingqondo zabo. Kodwa andiqondi mna mhlawumbi masithi noba abantu abamhlophe bangathatha impahla zabo bahambe namhlanje apha eMzantsi Afrika, andiqondi uba thina singakwazi ukubuyela ezingqondweni zethu. So ngolo hlobo ingaba kukuthelekisa okufanelekileyo na oku kuthiwa i-apartheid le ise-Israel ziyafana na ezi zinto? Enkosi.
Yeah, okay, sure. Those are the questions. Dinikela ke kuni ubaniphendule. But one thing I'm observing, educated people in South Africa are not so good at asking questions. They are very good at commenting, making comments, but asking a question, and maybe we need to check that. You know, each one of us must look into ourselves tonight and say, am I able to ask a question? Or am I good at commenting and all that? Because that's what I see has been happening here. And another thing, you people who have been asking questions, I'm sure you've been listening to the speakers here and feeling maybe the speakers are going for so long and so on. And then you grab the mic, and then you go more. You know, so that's how it is. You know, we're so much into the rush of talking that yeah, that's what we want to do. Theatre ma'am.
Thank you so much. Yeah, I think this is the beginning of a very long journey and lots of dialogue. And thank you for those. I thought those two questions were absolutely superb, and I hope I do justice to both. And if I don't, please, I'd love to engage with you and everybody. You know, perhaps I was unclear about what I was saying about normalizing black poverty. Actually, if we look back at apartheid, what we see was that there was a deep dehumanizing of blackness, deliberately so, because white people had to do that to cause the level of deep subjugation. And this level of dehumanization that happened, I will try and be quick, but I'd just like to address these things properly, is that we see it the same in Palestine, you know, at the moment, where apartheid Israel has been able to do what it's doing because it dehumanizes people. So what we've seen, what I was saying, and I hope I'm clearer this time, is that it isn't people who don't, I'm not saying black people don't look after each other. I'm saying what's happened with the ANC government, who in 1994, for some, this was a land of great expectations, but the ANC hasn't delivered. The apartheid made black people subhuman. And what I'm saying is black life's still so cheap in the ANC government that black people, it's almost the norm, I'm not saying the right thing, that black people still occupy the lowest stratum of society. And we saw an illustration that with Marikana, where I expect nothing from white people for black people. History's taught us that. That was the time I moved personally from the ANC to the EFF, because I saw a black government mow down its own people. Trade unions at that time said black life is cheap, and it was a question I posed. But no, so it was from that perspective. You know, I spoke about working at the Sowetan with Dr. Agri Cluster, and you might be too young to remember the memories that he had. But what we did, that was well into the state of emergency and under apartheid. You know, white people don't even take our advertisers every Thursday to Soweto to try to get a look in actually what's happening. That's the level that white people are so disconnected from what's happening. And what we found, and I witnessed this myself, was that white people were more interested in the state of the poor donkey than the state of a poor child. Now, I'm asking a controversial question. White people will, I mean, you'll never, nowhere in history have white people liberated or given power away. White people are very smart in terms of managing power, and that's the title of my book. It's White Power. And they will never let go of anything. If you're expecting them to, don't. And the thing is that if they can care more about a donkey than a black child, we can accept that because there's no moral compass. But for a black government to do that, it's terrible. And I'm saying, what is the legacy of the current government leaving to the people, the African child in this country, is a legacy of hunger, a legacy of landlessness, a legacy of being a third-class citizen. You know, it's the same as in the United States. For some stage, black people are recognized as 3/5 of a human being. It's the same thing. What I'm saying is it's not the black community that's doing that. It's the government, but that we're allowing. And a government that promised black liberation, and they can't even deliver service delivery, basic service delivery to people. To me, that's what I'm saying. How dare we not allow this to go on so that the black child of tomorrow is completely remains the servant of whiteness, still builds, like under colonialism, built foreign empires, is now building the empire of white people inside his and her own country. It's a shame. It's a shame of where we are, and there is no liberation. To answer the second question, and thank you. I think that was a great question. I did say that actually whiteness as a whole has no moral compass, and in my writings I've said I've looked for the moral compass in white people. I stand here and I say I've gone to the captains of industry of white people and I've said, I'm asking you, start the process of land, just give up land. Just start that process. You at the top, I'm an individual person. And those people have said, I've got land that can last me for 5-6 generations. That's my inheritance. That's what we call generational wealth. There's no desire. So what I'm saying to you, Biko tells me as a white person to go and work in the white community. I'm saying to you now, there's no moral compass. There's no ability, there's no interest in white people reconciling. They want to keep, and I must say it's masterful, this narrative, this rainbow nation, because they've remained absolutely in power. If people think we have a black government, that's absolutely not the case. So there's no soul to speak of white people. And I don't separate myself. The system is bankrupt on an ethical and spiritual way. I mean, I think we see who was that dreadful man, I think, who killed so many, Vlok, who then knelt down and tried to wipe the feet of some reverend. I mean, that is appalling. The only way, and that's what I've said, that caused white tears in that lecture I did many years ago, is to take back land unconditionally. Every bit of square land in this country does not belong to white people. And that's the only way to humble white people, to stop this power dynamic, and that unconditional, not land in use, but land that belongs to black people. That is the beginning and end. Let me just say one more thing. You know, when I say in the black mind is occupied, and I just want to make this point just before I go, and I know I'm being kicked off, but the issue is that we have to, and I'm writing another book now, and I'm speaking about black culpability in their own oppression. And it's a very uncomfortable question. And I could look upon a very fierce audience. Let me tell you, we have to ask a very difficult question. There's a very interesting book, this is my last point, written by Dr. Tom Burrell. He's an African-American, and he says that this concept of white supremacy is a brilliant marketing campaign of 400 to 500 years. But it's so good that white people don't even have to be present now. What they simply do is take the baton, give it to a black person, and the black person will run that race for the white master and finish off the race, literally and figuratively. Anyway, let me end there. Thank you.
I can go first. Oh, okay, fine. So that you can have the last word. So I'm sure, okay, maybe not go that way. I certainly agree with you. I'm sure you were pained in making the point thinking that I would disagree with you about political parties. I certainly agree with you. But my agreement with you, my own point goes further. I think that the problem we're facing as black people is not just the identities that are given to us by white people. You do not need the white people in their physical presence. I think that the problem, or rather the enemy we are facing, is larger. It's modernity. I think that in order to be able to get out of all of these problems, including the problem you might have had there, it is to think, what are the possibilities of transcending modernity for us? Because the system, as long as you remain within a modern organization of authority, modern organization of the economy, modern organization of, everyday relations, you are then not going to be able to escape those contradictions. So I teach in the American Academy now. Now something very odd happens, Russia has attacked Ukraine, and, we all must be involved now when white people are killing each other. But the worst is that just a few days ago, before there was an attack in Russia, the American intelligence, CIA, shared information with Russia about that possible attack. So who's fooling who? So America was able to share information with Russia that the possible attack they had in the town hall in a concert a few days ago was actually going to happen. What brought them together? What were the basis of that solidarity? So my point is that for as long as we remain with this modern organization of life, which is actually another way of saying that this is life organized for the perpetuation, of white, not just privilege, of reproduction of white life, I think that we would not be able to. So you can do away with political parties and do away with democracy. Modernity remains. It will still get, its pound of flesh by other means. It would still get its pound of flesh through the education system, through other means. I think we must have the audacity to think about other forms of being in the world as black people other than modern ways of organizing life. That's a larger task. It's a much more daunting task. I'm sure it scares many people, because this is what they know. So what would that world look like? So that's my answer to you. But, the other question on, what other economic systems can we look to? I have a problem when often even the people who think they are offering us alternative models of economic production and, models of allocation of value say that, well, rather than capitalism, why don't we organize the production of value differently and distribute it differently? The fundamental question is not value. It is, what is the purpose of life? Is a human being a homo economicus? Do we live to produce value? If we had any other value for life, would it be necessary then to think about economic production of value? So I think we haven't asked the more fundamental questions that would lead us escape the thraldom that we find ourselves in. We want to tinker with the system. But you see, this system is totalizing. you can't take parts of it and leave parts of it. You know, I often use the example, I'm sure you've heard me use it. It's like people who say, oh no, I want to have a lot of money, but when I have a lot of money, I won't behave like people who have money. I would share the money with, you know, poor people and whatnot. Money is not foolish. It also has its own ethic. So when you get it, it's not going to passively sit there and say, do as you wish with me. It has its own ethic. It's also going to demand of you to do certain things. So it's like modernity. You know, it's not going to foolishly sit there and say, okay, you know, you don't like this about us, take this. It has its own ethic. Once you accept it, it's also going to make its own demands, you know, to you. The West, they say the West oppressor is the hopeful millionaire.
Okay, I'm going to be very short. Yes. And we have elders amongst us, you know. Abantu kumele balale and take medicines. So I'm also just going to, so I'm going to answer by reference to sources for the most part. On the question of language symbolism and conquest, I hope we can have our own discussion because I'm not sure I understand the question precisely, but there's no time. But for people interested in this question, I think that, firstly, there's Fanon's chapter on language in Black Skins, White Masks, and then there's the collection of essays of Ngugi wa Thiong'os, which was Decolonizing the Mind, studying the question of conquest and history. So a much more erudite answer than I can give. On the question of just war, violence, and Ubuntu, I guess, I'll also be very short here. I suppose, as far as Christianity and the violence of warfare, I think Professor Ramos's "I conquer, therefore I'm sovereign" is a good account of examining the utility of this. But I suppose that the point which I hope to make, and you know, it's not enough time, we're arguing for a whole center, is the self-obfuscatory nature of conquest. You know, it's an insight from Machiavelli that the conqueror's highest aim is to erase the very fact of conquest. The success of conquest can only be there if the conqueror eliminates from the historical memory of the conquered the fact of conquest. Because of the explicit force which is attendant to conquest, it opens up the conqueror to Hobbes' state of nature, that you had the force to take my apple yesterday, I now have sufficient force to invade and take it back. So the conqueror must legitimize their current rule and appear to be ancient by erasing all contentions. That's why settlers invest so much in historiography, in order to convert force into a right, by rewriting how they came to be, by converting the natives into the settlers themselves, by erasing, including the history, for instance, of Bantu slavery through the use of interesting and chicanerous terms like in book and stele. You know, Bantu children were enslaved by the Voortrekkers, and it's another thing that's eliminated. So, but the heritage of historical thinking is one which we receive from our very historical enemies and have been directed towards us, as well as with the social sciences, to obfuscate the fact of the war which we lived through. And so this includes religion, it includes history. That's why the argument is that this must be a transdisciplinary endeavor, because it's a multifaceted order which has been able to perform our subjugation. The question which has been permeating here is, why do we obey? Why are we not in revolt right now, even though we've given some expositions of the force which underpins our subjection? Why do we nevertheless obey? But that is a question which the center will organize. I mean, this is the justification for the necessity of the study. Yeah. Otherwise, my brother, on Palestine, I would also like to get into this, but, you know, next event, in Prof. Thank you very much, everyone.
Yeah, now, Professor Siepe, please. Can you please just 5 minutes? Yeah.
Dumelang. Just to be brief, I hope. The question was asked by Professor Lada here. Why do we obey? And I think it goes to the heart of what the deliberations were about today, why the center should exist. And if the seminar was intended to answer that question, I think the point has been made. I just hope that this is recorded so that you can transcribe this and make sure that there's a book that emerges out of this. And I also want to thank the speakers here for the education. This is a free education that been given to us. I mean, normally for something like this, you'll pay in the U.S. many years ago close to 200,000, but we're able to get that in a short space of time. But the notion of obey reminds me of when I was a kid coming from school. I was about 7 years old, and I saw black men in a queue, lining up. And I noticed that where they were standing, it was not a bus stop, it was not a taxi rank. Then I asked why they're standing there. And they said they had been arrested. I looked around, I could not see the policeman. They said, no, the van was full. It has gone and will come back. So they were self-policing themselves. They couldn't run away because the apartheid government had instilled a fear of God in them. So there was no need for a white man or a policeman for them to police themselves. So why do we obey? We might be in the same state where we are so afraid of freedom that when it is presented, we actually would even stone whoever is talking about freedom to death. What Kim tried to put is what she called the never-ending story of white supremacy. And she invoked the notion that the past lies heavily on our shoulders and lies heavily on the present. And that what has happened post-1994 was the crystallization of the inequalities of apartheid. I think there are two things that she made. One is about reconciliation. And reconciliation that people praised, which was nothing more than a tranquilizing pill that was given to us. She called it a white man's medicine, which helped us to reconcile the black people, to reconcile with their poverty, while white people reconcile with their wealth that they got through apartheid and colonialism. Before the constitution that is so celebrated, before it was signed, black people did not have the land. 30 years later, with that constitution, they still don't have the land. And what is worse is that we are in a situation where we have to even erase our songs. Now, even you want to sing the song of the struggle songs, you are told that cannot be right. It's part of the broader erasure. You can see that eraser everywhere else. So, and at the same time, the same condition that black people found themselves continues. And here's a point that Verwoerd made, which Kim referred to. He says we should implement this policy in such a way that no future government may be able to reverse it. That the conditions should still be the same even if you have another government. And we find the same thing. The second thing that she mentioned was the obsession with what we call affirmation. That black people spend most of the time, or majority, seeking white affirmation. And that comes from Verwoerd again, because he said, by the time we've implemented this education, a black person will know that equality with whites is not for him or her. And black people have been busy trying to prove that they could be equal to white people. But what they don't realize that is a psychological entrapment. You will never be equal because they'll always change the goalpost. But when you do that, what will happen is that you are not able to chart your own agenda. You are busy spending your time pursuing that agenda. We saw that how historically and in real time, most of our people started rushing into white spaces, white universities, whatever, because we want that equality so bad. But even when you are there, they tell you, you're not good enough. Mahoba went to Oxford, got his PhD. When he went to Wits, and he talked about that the time for white people to determine the future of this country is over, they told him about standards. And one of the most vociferous person who told him about standards only had an honors degree. But that's the whiteness of being. So what Verwoerd said is that to force us to be so trapped that we're not able. So the question is, why do we obey? And I like the metaphor of a war. I mean, it sounds more for me like somebody who's in physics, for lack of better terms. But I do find it amazing that, as you rightfully indicated, the notion of war as determining who's going to live, who's going to die. And I thought your example of if somebody dies in Mamelodi, in Soshanguve, in Kailicha, it will not matter. But if you die here, it disturbs the order of things. But effectively, what you are saying is that the settlement, death is also part of this notion of the structural necessity. And yet, we were saying we are entering into this reconciliation to avoid war. But if you look at the number of people dying, we are in a war situation. So what it means that we need to go back and reconsider how we see and how the master narrative was given to us. So I thought I'm looking forward to that paper. And some of us, when we listen to people like yourselves, will be approaching you to say, can you just give me the reading material so that next time when I speak intelligently about these issues. So I hope you can prepare and just give me a list of material to read. And Dr. Lwazi, your take on slavery was also fascinating and liberating in the sense that it shows how impoverished our scholarship is. That when people think of slavery, not only in this country, they actually think of slavery as it happened in the transatlantic slavery. They fail to look at the impact and the existence of slavery in our own country and the implication both in terms of even the economic sectors, for me was very profound. And also explaining the whole notion of intergenerational wealth. That was also an outcome of slavery, was very profound. So in a sense, the three speakers made a profound case of why you guys want to run away from the plantation. And most of us are there.
Thank you, Professor Siepe. Professor Ramose, please come forward. So why we want to run from the plantation? Professor Ramose, the extraordinary.
Good afternoon. Oh, I see it is night time. So sorry, I almost said. Yeah, no, what a surprise. I had come to learn and not to speak. But anyway, my infinite gratitude to our three speakers. I really appreciate what I have heard and learned from you. I hope that I'm not speaking only for myself when I say that a lot has been learned from what you have said. Much appreciated. To give an example of what I have learned is that we have been reminded of Heraclitus. You know, his declaration is called Polemos Pater Pandoon. War is the father of all things. Well, Boulanger, the French historian, as cited by Michel Foucault, calls that the law of history. So what I'm suggesting is that I know you have seen that, but when you have the time, Ndumiso, please go back to chapter 9 of John Locke. He's got a chapter on conquest. Well, I want also to go on to the point about slavery. I liked everything that I have heard. I see that you touched even on the point of agriculture, how it developed in this country. It has developed in all parts of the world to such an extent that there is a problem today. We just ate, but we were talking about hunger. You know, since 1961, Kennedy declared that we can feed everybody. But today it is even worse because we have a world population of 7 billion and we have food available right now for 10 billion people. Nobody is asking, where are the children to feed because we have extra food? 10 billion. We have 3 billion food for nobody. For nobody. For nobody. So, then you also spoke about the emergence of the commercial bank. Now I want to go to you know, the bank, as we know, is the fortress of the rich and the guillotine of the poor. That we know. Now, I think we don't have to be so hungry, especially when we know that people are quiet about the fact that there is extra food but nobody to consume. Finally, it is thrown into the ocean. So you see, we must do something. Why? Because people are hungry now. Even when the center is established in Tatejak, people will be hungry now. not when we have finished our research. People are hungry now. Now, even now as we're talking, some have gone to bed without food. So, you know, I think we must do something. Before I come to that something, I want to touch briefly on the point of forgiveness. Ankosia. The warrior God of the Christians forgave Adam and Eve by the incarnation and then the resurrection. So there was definite forgiveness. This was one simple question. Why is this God unwilling to forgive Lucifer? So, now, we told also about this God. He loves. He's the God of infinite love. So love can do miracles. I'm coming now to my last point, which is, let us be so madly in love. Because, you know, people, we hear every day, people are madly in love. The assumption is they're doing good things because they are so madly in love. So let's do good things. Let's make sure that we stand against this guillotine called the bank. And make sure that we don't. I'm so grateful you talked about political parties. Let us throw them into the ocean. They are useless. Let us just stand and say, no payment of foreign debt we did not incur. No payment. No payment. Not tomorrow. You see, not tomorrow. Because we're dying now and we have excess food. We're dying now, we have excess food. So the bank must go. It's useless. It is killing us more. So the bank must go. Nyerere said this before, but you know, because we shiver always when we must be free. Now I am repeating, no payment to the bank. Let us keep only 1 cent at the bank. So that when our money comes into the bank, it pays the debt and there's what we owe. And then there is nothing more for the bank. You see, because if you go to the bank and ask for 20,000, you should have given us notice. But somebody or some people can have 40 or 500 million cash in paper bags. What can you see? So, no. And people are dying. When these things happen, my worry is the problem is now. And so, you know, it is good, and I like the idea of the center, but you know, where are the people? I'm also hoping that whoever is doing the research will at least go to check on our mothers in Marabastad. That's the nearest from here, you know. And just ayotenga timanga takuisa. You see, hot peanuts, because we can't eat the cold ones. You know, our stomach will start running. So at least you can buy takuisa. You just buy the hot ones in Marabas, so you can have conversation with those old people and see what if the center can mean anything to them. Remember, they are not schooled, most of them. I can assure you. Hey, ukasiva ro pika change. Ukasi. See, so they don't know banking. They will give you exact change. So centers are nice, I must say, but people are hungry. Now, not another time. Now. So I'm also pleading that when we engage in this game called academic, we must not forget our heritage, which tells us just one little but seriously important lesson, that in all this, humility matters. And it matters because really, mutu, ki mutu kabatu. Humility is already deeply embedded in that. Let us put it into practice, precisely by remembering that people are hungry now. Kyalebo.
Thank you very much. That was wonderful, Professor Ramose, the extraordinary Professor Ramose. Now I give Professor Chaka a moment to give the vote of thanks. And on that note, we can rush to the taverns.
No, thank you very much. It is actually very late now. We've gone way beyond what we had planned for this evening. Mine is just to thank you for having allowed yourself to come and spend this time on a Friday evening where you are at this moment. Just to say again, we have created a Facebook with a name similar to this, where we'll just keep you appraised with the developments. The idea is that we have 3 other provinces. So we'll keep you abreast with regards to the developments, but also share with you the whole context for why we need to have this center institute, and so allow for you to make your inputs there as well. So thank you very much for having, really respected our call to come to the space. You are now released for you to continue the rest of your evening. I hope there are still some taverns that are open for you to be able to celebrate. Thank you very much.